Thanks everyone for dialing into this webinar. I'm pleased to have the chance to talk to you all today. So I'll start first with a quick word about the Oklahoma Geological Survey. We're a state agency. We're located at the Norman campus of the University of Oklahoma, and our charge is to investigate the state's land, water, mineral, and energy resources and disseminate the results of those investigations to promote wise use of Oklahoma's natural resources, consistent with sound environmental practices, which I consider to be just a piece of wise use. We're not a regulatory agency, so once we had weighed in that in fact the cause of these earthquakes was most likely oil and gas operations, some of the pressure off us and shifted over to the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. I'll talk about what they do in a bit. My next slide is a quick bit of tutorial to remind people about earthquakes, that the Richter scale we use to measure earthquake magnitude is a logarithmic scale. It represents an estimate of the amount of energy released in an earthquake. As you go up 1 unit on the Richter scale, you're going up a factor of 10 in shaking and a factor of 32 approximately in energy release. So the energy release of a magnitude 5 earthquake is 1,000 times that of a magnitude 3. And for example, the magnitude 7.1 earthquake in the beginning of January of 2016 released more seismic energy than all the earthquakes in Oklahoma since 2009, and actually probably further back than that. The flip side of this are a couple of highlights I usually like to show for Oklahomans who can appreciate this. The average tornado releases as much energy as a magnitude 4.8 earthquake, and a large lightning bolt is equivalent to a magnitude 3.2 earthquake. So as I said, it's a scaled estimate. It's measured in multiple different ways. We're really looking at estimating from the seismic trace we see from a seismometer. We generally report a local magnitude that's roughly equivalent to the old-fashioned Richter magnitude, but for larger earthquakes we calculate the more precise moment magnitude. This is why the actual magnitude will sometimes change if you're just looking at the USGS website or our website to track some of these earthquakes, and why headlines in the news often report a higher value than what is ultimately in the catalog. Earthquake intensity, which the magnitude essentially is a measure of the energy release. It doesn't change as you move away, but the earthquake intensity does. It varies with distance from the earthquake. It can vary with respect to depth of the earthquake and with respect to the amount of the soils underneath you, in essence. It's a qualitative estimate using what's called the modified Mercalli scale, ranging from 1 to 12. Didn't feel it all the way to total destruction. For the most part, the earthquakes in Oklahoma have been relatively moderate in that regard, but they have been felt rather widely. We had reports for our largest earthquake, the Pawnee earthquake, as far away as Chicago. Here's the network that Oklahoma monitors in order to determine where earthquakes are and how big they are. We monitor about 100 stations here. There are a lot of temporary stations that move in, especially after our larger events. You can see a cluster up in the northwest that reflects the Pawnee, or the earthquake up on the Galena Township fault near Fairview, and in the northeast there's the cluster of instruments that were moved in after the Pawnee earthquake in September on Labor Day. That was our largest historic earthquake. So here is a map of earthquakes in 2016, highlighting those 3 magnitude 5 earthquakes. You can see that there are 2 main areas occupying something on the order of 15 or 16 counties in all. 98% of the seismicity is there. It's not the whole state that's shaking. You can download these maps, and you can also see the entire catalog if you have the need to see it at our website at the Oklahoma Geological Survey. So the pattern mainly occupies 2 areas: the central area around Stillwater, sort of south from Pawnee and Noble and Garfield counties, down towards Oklahoma City in the south there, and then the northwestern area, northwest of Enid. And those are sort of 2 separate areas, and they have different histories of earthquakes in this. So how does human activity induce earthquakes? The 3 main mechanisms have been described in a variety of places. This slide shows those 3. You can load a piece of the crust sufficiently that stress shifts in the basement can cause faults to move. That happened behind underneath Lake Mead, or underneath and near Lake Mead, when they were filling the reservoir up. And it also happened around the Oroville Dam. There was a magnitude 5.8 earthquake, equal to the largest historic earthquake in Oklahoma, around the Oroville Dam I believe when they were filling it up in 1975. You can also create earthquakes by extracting oil and gas or geothermal fluids, and most geothermal areas do see active seismicity as they're producing hot water to generate electricity. The Groningen field in the Netherlands started producing gas in the 1960s, started having earthquakes in the 1990s, and now has a very comprehensive seismicity management program that has to do with, that actually tailors production to try and minimize the number of earthquakes. But the mechanism that's happening, that's operating as far as we can tell in most of Oklahoma, is somewhat different from that. It involves injection of, in this case, wastewater from oil and gas operations into a horizon that sits directly on basement and appears to have communication pathways down into basement that then are able to contact deep-seated faults, raise the pore pressure in those faults, and thereby make it easier for those faults to move. That's the dominant mechanism deduced. We're seeing some modifications of this, but they're still generally related to the injection mechanism. On average, the earthquakes in 2016 were at a depth of 5.8 kilometers, 19 to 20,000 feet, well below the sedimentary section, well below the operational depth of any oil and gas operations. They also occur on fault orientations that are favorably disposed to the approximately east-west stress field. In other words, those are the planes, those strike slip planes there are the ones that are most easy to move in shear in that stress field. Luckily, most of our really large faults run roughly north-south, and so they're in exactly the wrong orientation to cause earthquakes. A lot of the earthquakes have happened near some of these faults, but in essence, they're on small splays adjacent to them. In addition, the earthquakes are happening in areas where there are large volume disposal wells. The purple dots greater than 500,000 barrels a month. The blue dots 150 to 500,000 barrels a month. And you can see that the two main earthquake areas, the one between the two red faults there in the south central or in the central area, and the one up to the northwest with the largest dots in there, those are the main areas where earthquakes are happening. They're the areas where water is being disposed of in very large quantities. However, contrary to one of the most widespread myths on both coasts, most of this is not driven by hydraulic fracturing. It's driven by wastewater that's essentially ancient seawater. It's produced formation water. Less than 5% of the volume being disposed of in the earthquake-prone areas in Oklahoma consists of frac flowback volume. There has been a previous estimate in another area that a very large fraction of the water is flowback volume, but they failed to account for the fact that only about 30% of flowback of water usually that was used in a frac actually flows back. And so I think that estimate that it was 60 to 100% of it was flowback was in error. And probably the numbers are fairly close to what we see in Oklahoma. So these are not frac quakes. It turns out there are some frac quakes, and I'll talk a little bit about them later. This chart shows the actual pattern of seismicity in the area in Oklahoma. All earthquakes greater than 2.5, and you really kind of need to have a lower cutoff because completeness is a significant issue. As you get down into the smaller earthquakes, we don't necessarily track all of them. We don't have the time or the resources to track all the earthquakes down as low as we can actually detect them. In the same chart, I've shown injection into the Arbuckle group, the formation that sits on top of basement. It's thick, it's permeable, it's been taking water since the 1930s, and it was an ideal disposal horizon, separated a long way from any groundwater. But in essence, in the period from about 2005 to about 2014, we discovered just how much it could take. The chart shows in light blue the actual daily number of earthquakes bigger than 2.5. In dark blue, the 30-day running average, which shows how episodic seismicity is in Oklahoma. And the red line gives you a better idea of the overall trend. One of the things that's been missing quite regularly from reports that point out that the rise in seismicity is due to the rise in injection, they haven't gotten around to creating the boilerplate in most articles that point out that the decline in seismicity also parallels the decline in injection in this area. And that's equally strong evidence that in fact it is the injection that's responsible. So what has the state done? The first action was that the governor created a coordinating council on city attended by regulatory groups, by the major research universities, and by oil and gas companies. And it's been an opportunity to sort of hash out the issues of what's causing this seismicity in the early days when the rate was not as high, and sort of vet some of the ideas that the Corporation Commission has about how best to reduce seismicity by means of directives that reduce injection. In addition, starting in 2015, the OCC itself started putting out these directives, starting first with just telling people to either show they were not injecting directly into the basement, but or plug back out of the basement if they were, or cut their injection by 50%. From then on, there were responses to a variety of earthquake events, and then eventually some more regional reductions required, and most recently actually putting a cap on injection within the earthquake area of interest. In 2015, in early 2015, the Oklahoma Geological Survey released a position paper that declared our conclusion that most of these earthquakes were indeed induced earthquakes caused by injection by wastewater disposal in the earthquake-prone area. Also in 2015, the Secretary of Energy found some money to fund projects to investigate what's going on here. Those covered the range from geological to hydrological to seismological, because in fact the problem is not just earthquakes, and we won't solve it simply by better tracking of the earthquakes and better analysis of the earthquakes. It really comes back to understanding the geology of the Arbuckle unit, understanding the hydrology of the Arbuckle unit and the basement. In addition, the governor created a task force as part of her Water for 2060 program, a produced water working group that has released a preliminary report which evaluated 15 specific scenarios, pairing a local use with a county with a lot of produced water. I believe it may be the first of its kind, but I can't swear to that. We also received a Resource Partnership to Secure Energy for America grant that funded additional stations for the OGS network and a great deal of integrated geologic and geophysical work to understand what was going on. In 2016, the governor released almost $1.4 million from her emergency fund to both the Corporation Commission and the Oklahoma Geological Survey. The OCC put its money into a tracking system for both earthquakes and injection that they call I've forgotten their cool name for it. At any rate, it does a very good job of identifying where things are going on, and they've used it to respond. It used to be that it took them 2 or 3 weeks to respond to a particular event. When the Pawnee earthquake happened, they were out that day with a response, and then actually as the aftershock pattern evolved, they had to shift their response area and make a change 2 days later, 2 or 3 days later. So here is the area of interest defined by the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, superimposed on that earthquake map I showed you before. You can see it's strongly influenced by some of the faults in the area. And then there's an eastern and a western portion of it, and they have slightly different controls. At this point, all the wells in this earthquake area of interest, all the injection wells have to submit weekly reports of their daily injection rate, so we have a very up-to-date database of what's going into the ground. Virtually all the wells in the Precambrian basement have been plugged back or have drastically cut their injection. In fact, I think some have subsequently shut in. The overall reduction has reduced, has been approximately 900,000 barrels of water per day since mid-2015. An amount which has not been strongly reported on, again, in the news. And then this most recent action, which capped injection in the western and eastern areas of interest. So the effect has been quite dramatic. Here we show in green, the oil price, West Texas Intermediate, and show the substantial drop that occurred in mid-2014. We also see that injection in the 684 Arbuckle wells that were responsible for most of this seismicity plateau shortly after that, and then start a rapid decline. That decline started ahead of Oklahoma Corporation Commission activity to direct people to start shutting things in, and therefore may have eased the pain of doing some of those reductions, but it has been meant a very substantial loss in revenue for many of these companies because they aren't able to really to transfer that water to anywhere else. So it means shutting in production. But you can also see that much of the reduction, and I don't believe we've actually captured all of it on this chart. I think there are further reductions that we haven't quite captured. Much of the reduction that's gone on has now been captured by those directives, so there's a kind of a ceiling for any companies that might want to come back with a rise in oil price and inject some more. In addition, I think the Corporation Commission is exceedingly sensitive to any change in the injection rates. They also aren't permitting any new Arbuckle wells. Let me highlight some of the recommendations of that Produced Water Task Force that we mentioned before. A lot of them had to do with targeted regulation and legislation to remove some of the legal ambiguities about who owns produced water. Because it's sometimes contaminated with oil, it's actually even legally referred to in some cases as oil. Establish bonding requirements for water impoundments, for large-scale water impoundments, without being an impediment. Make sure that there is something in place that can cover any losses, but also make sure it isn't stopping activity in this area. Make right-of-ways for pipelines a little easier to obtain, and request delegation for discharge permits from the EPA. Then there are a number of studies to be done. Study the feasibility of transferring Mississippi limestone production. This is one of the high water cut plays that's responsible for our high seismicity. Transfer that to the stack play where actually they don't have enough water to do the fracking. There may be minimal treatment requirements to use that water. The cheapest alternatives they found really did have to do with reuse of the water in oil field operations. Evaporation methods and other alternatives tend to be sufficiently expensive that they're probably not going to be sufficient to change things for these very high water cut wells. When you have 20, 40, 60 barrels of water for every barrel of oil, you can't afford to spend $4 a barrel to treat it in an environment where oil is priced at $50 to $60 a barrel. I want to quickly highlight another area of interest, and that's earthquakes associated with hydraulic fracturing. This is an example from southern Oklahoma where two small clusters of earthquakes happened during the course of completion of the well 4-18. They happened at depths roughly equivalent to that where the fracking was going on, which is interesting in and of itself. Many other places we've seen this, the earthquakes are happening down in the basement just as they are for the injection. In addition, on the D figure in the lower right, you can see that the earthquakes, the black bars are the frac stages, the timing of the frac stages. You can see that the earthquakes happen during stages 2 and 4. And I think there are reasons to believe that had to do with the amount of fluid that was going in there. The stack and scoop play areas have seen some of these earthquakes in 2016. You can see a few of these small clusters. These earthquakes tend to be smaller. We have a very small number of them, bigger than magnitude 3. Mostly they're down in the 2s and 1s. So it's actually pretty challenging to start detecting these quickly. On the other hand, we have seen operators actually take action to change their frac jobs, to pause and figure out what to do, and actually seen the earthquakes stop in many cases. So these are very manageable groups of relatively small earthquakes happening in a relatively small fraction of frac jobs. The OCC has put out well completion guidance on seismicity so that if they see seismic activity within 2 kilometers from their completion operations, they have a stoplight system with progressive levels of action depending on whether it's a greater than 2.5, greater than 3, greater than 3.5 magnitude earthquake. Escalating degrees of review, either simply make contact and make sure that we know what's going on. And the Oklahoma Geological Survey report is the magnitude of record. Many companies do actually have in place their own seismic networks, and in some cases they're actually beginning to see these before it reaches magnitude 2.5. On the other hand, it's not yet clear whether you really see magnitude build up or if it can come on quite suddenly in these cases. We don't have enough cases yet. At any rate, operations may resume if seismicity stops and the mitigation approach is considered adequate. We do have envisioned a much more comprehensive, high-quality seismic network. The total cost of this across all of Oklahoma would be on the order of $4 million. We think we can do this in stages and break it down into $1 to $1.5 million chunks. we're looking to see how best to fund that. I'd like to acknowledge my staff, the whole seismology team led by Jake Walter and Jefferson Chang, Fernando Ferrer, Andrew Thiel, and especially Isaac Wolfel, the technician who keeps these machines running. But as I said before, it's not just seismicity. We have our hydrologist, Kyle Murray, and some of his staff, Ella and Jordan, our geophysicists, Kevin Crane and Steve Holloway, and of course, our publications and outreach guy, Ted Satterfield, has been essential in getting information out. And of course, I have to acknowledge the Oklahoma Governor's Emergency Fund, the Secretary of Energy and Environment for his Recovery Act contribution, and the Research Partnership to Secure Energy for America for giving us the funding we need to go beyond what we had before. Thank you.